Hi, this is the Historical Site, and today I'm going to make a video on 100 years of independence for Ukraine. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to us at the Historical Site before the video starts. Thank you so much, and we appreciate you all. The past 100 years for Ukraine has been quite the tumultuous journey, full of political intrigue and vying for their place in the world. Starting off the story of the past 100 years, we're going to start in 1917. During this time, Ukraine was split between Austro-Hungary and Russia. Through years of tension, Ukraine, literature, publications, and intellectuals had been suppressed in Russia due to the fear of their nationalistic tendencies and Ukraine seceding from Russia. Ukrainian subjects were often exiled from Ukraine to places like Siberia. Russia also prohibited the language of Ukraine, as well as closed down Ukrainian institutions. This was called Russification. However, there was much issues going on with Russia, and revolution was brewing. Vladimir Lenin and his Bolshevik Communist Party had enough of the Tsar. As the Russians changed their government and formed the Soviet Union, Ukraine quickly saw opportunity, and Ukraine proclaimed their independence. However, this didn't last long. In 1918, the Bolsheviks launched their first offensive and advanced on Kiev. And by 1922, the Soviets had incorporated Ukraine into their fold, becoming the Socialist Republic of Ukraine. Ukraine was a key area for the Soviets because it provided, at some points, 50% of the grain to the Soviet Union, being called the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, and nowadays the breadbasket of Europe. It should come as no surprise, one of the generals of this military engagement was none other than Joseph Stalin, who firsthand was able to see the nationalistic identity and tendencies of Ukrainians. This brings us to our next point. In 1933, the Holodomor. The Holodomor was a genocide that occurred in Ukraine. It took shape via a staged famine. Holodomor translates in Ukrainian to hunger and extermination. Much of this famine was caused by forced collectivization and the Soviets seizing all farmland within the Soviet Union and all farmland belonging directly to the state. This includes the produce and eventually also the animals, oftentimes forcing Ukrainians to leave their land and to give up their personal property, as Soviets accused them of being kulaks, or wealthy landowners, essentially causing class warfare in Ukraine. But the Soviets called just about anyone who resisted them a kulak. So, as we know, this collectivization led to a drop in production from Ukrainians. The Ukrainians were less likely to produce and take good care of their land if they didn't actually get to reap profit from their land. This led to food shortages, rebellions, uprisings against the Soviet Union. This terrified Stalin, as he had seen the nationalistic tendencies of Ukraine just 12 years before. So, what did the Soviets do? They made the famine worse, seizing all of the crops and not giving food back to specific towns that were considered blacklisted. Soon, Soviets started to ransack Ukrainian homes, taking any food, rations, personal property that the poor Ukrainians had left. They also prevented Ukrainians from leaving Ukraine to search for food, essentially making death inevitable. The Soviets did not just starve the Ukrainians, they also made political assassinations against intellectuals, teachers, anyone who identified as a nationalist in Ukraine, or what was considered to be a nationalist, having Stalin's preferred effect of destroying the national identity of Ukraine. and firmly having them under the grip of the Soviet Union. The Holodomor, which led to the deaths of up to 5 million Ukrainians, is largely denied from the Russians today, as they refer to it solely as just a famine. Now we're going to go to 1954. At this point, Ukraine has been under Soviet rule for some time. And the Soviet Union gives the Socialist Republic of Ukraine Crimea as part of its republic. This was largely done as the Tatars, the native people of Crimea, were deported from Crimea to other parts of the Soviet Union, like Kazakhstan. And Ukrainians were allowed to move into that land and start farming it. This also improved happiness among Ukraine, which was sort of the intended reason for doing it. This is important today because there's ongoing dispute as to who really owns or should have Crimea. And as you can see, it is Ukrainian land. It was given to Ukraine. Right, so this brings us to 1991, during the collapse of the Soviet Union. Ukraine once again voted for their independence, and a stunning 92% of Ukraine decided they wanted to be independent of the Soviet Union and Russia. This also includes Crimea voting to stay with Ukraine. After 70 years of brutal oppression, Ukraine is finally independent. Next, we move into a more modern period, 2013. After years of Ukrainian independence and its tentative place in the world, not being sure whether it should be more pro-Russian or pro-Western democracy, Ukraine has an election in 2004, which is important to the 2013 bullet that I'm going to refer to. In 2004, President Yanukovych had won an election. However, it was proven to be a fraudulent election. Many Ukrainians took to the streets and protested, which is now what is known as the Orange Revolution. Yanukovych then had to participate in a rerun in which he lost to Viktor Yushchenko and Yulia Tymoshenko, who were more pro-EU Democratic candidates. The rerun was largely due to the large participation in the Orange Revolution, which some estimate up to 1 million Ukrainians took to the street. However, in 2010, Yanukovych ran yet again. This time he won. This election was deemed fair by the international community. However, many Ukrainians still didn't think it was fair, as Yanukovych had close ties with Russia. Once in office in 2010, Yanukovych immediately started making pro-Russian deals, and the international community wondered where Ukraine would go. Yanukovych quickly started arresting opposition, such as Yulia Tymoshenko, who was his opposition, imprisoning her for 7 years. In 2013, as rule of law is starting to falter in Ukraine, and many of the constitutional provisions put into power in 2004 were decreased, giving the president more power, which is Yanukovych. So, in 2013, a highly anticipated association agreement between Yanukovych and EU representatives was canceled. This association agreement would have provided Ukrainians money for research, access to European market, as well as finances, and would open the door for them to join the EU and NATO. However, Yanukovych was put on blast essentially by Russia, and many believe was working hand in hand with Russia and Vladimir Putin. This led to another set of protests by the Ukrainian people, known as the Maidan protests, which was where Ukrainians took to the streets and protested the cancellation of this agreement and the path that Ukraine seemed to be taking back into the Russian fold. Many pro-democratic EU Ukrainians took to the streets. They were eventually met by gunfire, with over 100 Ukrainian protesters being killed. This prompted months of protesting by the Ukrainian people, and eventually the ousting of Yanukovych. Yanukovych fled to none other than Russia. After this event, in 2014, the invasion of Crimea happened, where Russian pro-separatists, as Putin calls them, or little green men, which referred to soldiers who had no official uniform or insignia, however were using Russian weapons, had masks on, and wanted to see Ukraine back in the Russian fold. These little green men took control of Crimea and allegedly staged elections that were not perceived as fair at all by the international community. The results were 97% of Crimea choosing to be part of Russia. Putin quickly enacted a law to make Crimea part of Russia and no longer had to abide by the lease agreement in Sevastopol. One of the reasons why Crimea is so important to Russia is it's a staging point of many of their attacks on Ukraine, as well as also gives them access to the Black Sea. Putin tended to claim to have no involvement of these pro-Russian separatists who had Russian weapons. Eventually, fighting broke out in Donetsk and Luhansk in eastern Ukraine, with more pro-Russian separatists, as well as continued denied involvement by Putin. This brings us to our last point. In 2022, Russia began its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, sending a world still dealing with a global pandemic into a state of emergency. Today being the 1-year point of the war, Ukraine stands strong, still fighting, and with Russia taking massive losses. Western intelligence agencies estimate about 200,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded since the war began, and about 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers. This is a critical juncture in the war, as Russia is expected to ramp up, and has already been ramping up, attacks in eastern Ukraine, mostly in Bakhmut, with a private military group called the Wagner, taking troops who were initially prisoners in Russian prisons and offering them amnesty for their crimes as long as they participated in 6 months of combat in Ukraine. Ukraine has largely relied on Western supplies, but will continue to need Western supplies to sustain the war. In specific, artillery rounds. The EU and the West is quickly debating on pivoting to more production for military equipment for the war in Ukraine. Thank you for listening. Please like, share, and subscribe for more videos like this. Thank you.
Oh, freedom!